Associate Professor Jamus Lim.
Mr. Speaker, I understand that the stipulations in the government borrowing miscellaneous amendment bill are of a largely technical nature, aiming to repeal various mostly spent acts and to consolidate aggregate borrowing by the government across sectors. This is fairly obscure, so obscure in fact that I noticed that initially I was the only member slated to speak on this, but evidently two others have since found this topic similarly irresistible. I favor such simplification, and I do not have substantive concerns about the specificities in the proposed amendments. I do wish, however, to make a few points that I think have more to do with potentially unintended consequences of the current iteration of the bill. These have to do with the debt limit precluding the acceptance of advanced deposits by the MAS for treasury bills, and the lack of justification for rejecting sales. The first point worth noting is that Clause 14 of the bill proposes to set the borrowing limit for government loans at 1.065 trillion, which represents the combined limits of 960 billion for the government securities and 105 billion treasury bills that currently exist under two separate acts. This new limit may then be increased by parliamentary resolution, which simplifies since logically all forms of debt, whether short-term or long-term, should, of course, be treated as a component of the overall liability picture, and hence subject to the same form of debt ceiling discipline. Given this observation, would it not also make sense to enfold remaining instruments under government borrowing, such as Singapore bonds issued under the Significant Infrastructure Government Loan Act, to the same limit? I understand, of course, as Minister Wong has mentioned, that this is, in fact, a separate accounting convention. Now, this limit, to be clear, is relatively small at 90 billion. And there is a clear benefit to consolidating under one roof, which is that the consolidated limit would simplify monitoring and allow fiscal policymakers to ultimately focus on a single figure. So the natural objection, of course, to this is that the government maintains these separate limits for debt that serve developmental objectives, such as infrastructure, which is the case for Singapore, versus those issued under risk transfer and investment purposes, for the purposes of CPF funds, as mentioned earlier, or to fulfill liquidity and depth functions. Now, the Ministry of Finance has steadfastly held that all these require separate limit accounts. But from the perspective of understanding the underlying economics, all money is ultimately fungible, and it's unclear why debt issued under one type of accounting constraint cannot subsequently be redeployed to other functions so long as it is only a matter of protocol, rather than one entrenched in actual legislation that prevents subsequent transfer. Of course, such deviations need not occur under this government, but they could easily occur under another, perhaps more profligate one. Hence, even if we did wish to maintain separate debt ceilings for the purposes of accounting, perhaps it may be worth, nevertheless, incorporating these distinct limits into this bill. And this is especially the case since, insofar as financial markets are concerned, they view the consolidated government balance sheet as a whole, as they should. And indeed, Singapore bonds do not appear to have affected the Singapore government's overall credit rating, which is yet another economic reason to not hive off such limits for the instrument. Concomitantly, it's also important to calibrate the frequency with which this limit is modified. While fiscal rules, such as a reasonable debt limit, have been used in many countries and can play an important role in ensuring the sustainability of fiscal affairs, a debt ceiling that is too frequently binding can wreak havoc on the efficient operation of government, as the experience of the United States, where bipartisan brinksmanship routinely plagues efforts to raise the debt ceiling, reminds us. To this effect, may I inquire whether this government has considered whether this limit is appropriate? What is the premise or justification behind the current debt limit ceiling amount of $1.065 trillion? And is there a body that routinely examines the veracity of this debt limit, and how frequently should we expect to change this? The second point, Mr. Speaker, I wish to raise has to do with how Clause 20 of the bill restricts the ability of other government entities, in particular the MES, from accepting advance deposits in anticipation of raising loans by way of treasury bills. While this may be a sound principle in practice, history is rife with examples of central banks that have gone ahead and monetized debt on behalf of a profligate sovereign, breeding inflation as a result. It is worth noting that two recent developments may yet necessitate additional flexibility for the monetary authority to act in an anticipatory manner. The first such circumstance, as members of this House would be aware of, has to do with the zero lower bound faced by nominal interest rates. Although Singapore has never quite faced this problem in the aftermath of the global financial crisis of 07-08, and the MAS, unlike most central banks, targets the nominal exchange rate rather than the policy interest rate. It's nevertheless worth keeping in mind that one prescription to the problem of the zero lower bound is to allow for central banks to intervene directly in short-term money markets by issuing securities on their own account. The second situation has to do with the emerging central bank digital currency landscape. Such CBDCs are likely to become a permanent part of the future of central banking worldwide, and I understand that MES is on the forefront of this and even commissioned a sandbox for studying the usage of such currencies. While the detailed findings of this exercise have yet to be made public, it's reasonable to ask if the practical implementation of CBDCs may yet require flexibility for MAS to be able to accept such advanced deposits for treasury bills, and if this bill would preclude such action. Hence, while I accept that these two conditions are somewhat unusual, it's nevertheless worth asking if this particular clause in the bill may unnecessarily tie the hands of the MES to operate in a modern global macroeconomic environment. Finally, Clause 24 of the bill explicitly states that the authority may, and I quote, refuse any application to take up government securities or treasury bills issued without assigning any reason. Now, while I accept the prerogative of the government to reserve the right to refuse the sale of its debt to any given entity, it's also surely reasonable, at least, for Singaporean purchasers to be provided some form of explanation for why they are unable to purchase the debt of their own government. Notwithstanding these reservations and questions, Mr. Speaker, I support the bill.